My greetings to all the viewers of this Pyramid Meditation channel. First of all, I congratulate the channel for doing so much of work for the last so many years. For the last so many years, Sri Patriji has been doing such a great work in popularizing the system of meditation, which is something which is unique to the Indian tradition. In fact, for all the schools of philosophy, not only for Vedanta, not only for the Patanjali Yoga Sutra, but even for all of the philosophies, for all other branches of knowledge, this yoga is something which has been popular, and yoga has now become totally neutral. Yoga is now, it does not belong to a particular group, it does not belong to a particular Vedanta school of philosophy, or it doesn't belong to only Patanjali school of philosophy, or it is not confined to something like Buddhism or Jainism. It has now become universal. So it only means that there are so many universal features which are there in this yoga. The Bhagavad Gita and the yoga, what Gita says about the yoga. And of course, Gita, we know that it is a subject, the subject is rather different. Gita, we know that generally all of us have some idea about the Gita. It was told by a warrior to another warrior in the battlefield. It is not something which is now, whenever we hear about Gita, immediately a mental picture comes to us. That is somebody, some Swamiji sitting, and then some sort of religious atmosphere, and some sort of bhajan, etc. also might be going on. So in such atmosphere, the Swamiji will be reciting some shloka, and he will be reciting some stories, etc. So that is the ambience which comes to our mind when we think of Gita. But then Gita it did not originate in that ambience. It originated in the battlefield, and it was told by one warrior, as I said, to another warrior who was having some type of doubt. He was in a sort of confusion. He was in a sort of moral dilemma about the battle itself. And a person who was about to get engaged in the battle, he himself had made all preparations for the battle. And he along with his people, he came, he mobilized the army, he mobilized a lot many kings as their supporters, and then they all came. The entire armies were arrayed on both sides, and then at that time, this gentleman wanted to have a look at who are there on the other side. And when he looked at the people on the other side, he found that there were so many relatives, so many elders whom he respected. So at that time, he just collapsed in a sort of moral dilemma. So that was the context in which another warrior, his purpose was to tell about what is dharma, what is right. So what is right? That is the point. What is the right action? So that is the basic point in Gita. Gita has nothing to do with sannyasis, unfortunately, because there is nobody else who is teaching the Gita. Some sannyasi, some ashrama, there is some ashrama, it may be some Chinmayananda ashrama, Ramakrishna mission, or some such people. They do give some talk, and all our people, they think, oh, it is something belonging to Swamijis, we have nothing to do with that. But if we see the Gita as such, what happens in the Gita? In fact, to whom is it meant? If you want to see in Krishna's own words, it is actually intended for whom? It is intended for the kings. If you see the chapter number 4 actually starts with Krishna's words. So in that, the entire chapter 1, it tells about, or rather it describes the mental framework of Arjuna, the anguish which generates in Arjuna's mind on seeing all the relatives in front of him. And at that time, the Gandiva, the bow slips from his hands, and then he himself collapses. He can't even stand. So he collapses at the base of the chariot. So that is what we see there. And this, starting from second chapter also, after about 8-9 verses from Arjuna's side, then Krishna starts telling, "Arey, what is this? You are talking like a fool. You are talking," in fact, he uses a very strong word. Klaibyam asmagamah partha. Klaibyam. Don't talk like you are talking like an unmanly person. In fact, Kliba actually means a eunuch. Klaibyam is that state of impotence. Don't talk like an impotent person. So Krishna chides him, because Krishna and Arjuna, of course, they are so friendly. So Krishna chides him and tells him, yeah, what is it you are doing? Then he tells him, what is the duty? What is dharma? And while explaining what is dharma, he gives a very broad perspective. Because Arjuna is a man who is also a learned person, not an ordinary person. Arjuna also is a Kshatriya, and in those days for all the Kshatriyas, in fact, the study of Vedas was very much prescribed. It was a syllabus, it was part of the syllabus for all the Kshatriyas to study the Vedas. Why? Because they are supposed to know what is dharma, what is right and what is wrong in various situations. Vedas are not about puja, and Vedas are not about mantras, etc. Vedas are about how a person has to conduct oneself in life, how a person has to achieve success in life, and also do it in such a way that his afterlife means after death, we all believe in there is something called heaven, etc. All religions, they do believe there is something called heaven, there is something called liberation, moksha, etc. So afterlife, his afterlife should be happy. Whatever we do today, it has to give me happiness tomorrow. Suppose I am doing something today, and what I do today is something which is idiotic and which lands me in trouble tomorrow. It is something that is not to be done. So we have to conduct ourselves in the world in such a way, while achieving all success, while enjoying all things, while enjoying what all is permitted to be enjoyed. Not that we can enjoy anything and everything. There are certain things which are permitted by dharma. So whatever has been permitted by the dharma, we are permitted to enjoy, and then we are permitted to achieve success in the process of dharma, in the path of in a right manner. In a right manner, we are supposed to achieve things, not in a wrong manner. And then we are also all this work. If we are doing it in a perfect manner, it paves the way. It paves the way for higher thing. Higher thing means it may be either what we call heaven, or it may be what we call liberation. So this is the pattern in which it is. And as I said, how do kings come into the picture? It is for everybody. There is no doubt Gita is for everybody. Gita is not only for kings, but it was actually told to the kings in the initial days. Why? Krishna says, as I said, the very fourth chapter, the very first shloka, he says, Imam vivasvate yogam proktavanaham avyayam. Vivaswan manave praha manu rikshvakave bravit. It goes on like that. 2-3 shlokas, they go on like that. And the meaning of the shloka is, Krishna, when he says I, in that Bhagavad Gita, wherever Krishna says I, he is not talking like some historical character called Krishna who was there some 5,000 years ago, the person who was born to Vasudeva and Devaki. We should not think like that. Krishna, when he says I in the Gita, in the context of Gita, he is talking as the spokesperson for what we call the highest reality or supreme reality, what we call in Vedanta, we call it Brahma. So whatever we call God, loosely, very loosely we can call it God also. So he is talking from the perspective of God. He is talking from the perspective of God, and he says, yes, I told it to the sun god. Okay, sun god, many people, we may not accept that it is a god and all that. Sun, moon, etc., they are all things which are great manifestations in this universe. So our tradition says that all the whole universe is pervaded by what is called consciousness, and that consciousness is something which is the only reality in the entire universe. The only reality is that consciousness, and that consciousness is that is what is manifested in this sun, the moon, and everything. So he says, okay, leave alone sun right now, because that is another topic. So I told it to the sun god. He told it to Vivaswan Manave Praha. He told this to his son Manu. We often hear about what is called Manu, Manusmriti, Manu Dharma Shastra, etc., etc. He is that king. Manu is not actually a sage or a rishi or a Brahmin. Manu was a king. Manu Ikshvakave Bravit. Manu told his son Ikshvaku. And who is this Ikshvaku? We know that Rama belongs to that Ikshvaku clan. Ikshvaku Vamsha Prabhavo, we say. So Rama, that is the solar race. We believe that there is a whole race of kings started from the sun, and another whole race, a huge race started from the moon, etc. We believe. Not only we, of course, all ancient civilizations, they believed. Not only we. So anyway, so this thing was told by sun god to his son Manu, and Manu told his son Ikshvaku, and evam parampara proktam imam rajarshayo viduhu, says Krishna. So, in that manner, parampara means from father to son, from father to son, from father to son. In that manner, the whole Gita was passed on down the generations. It was passed down the generations, and through whom? To all through these Rajarshis. Rajarshi is at the same time a king and also a rishi. That means a saintly king. What Plato calls the philosopher king. We have heard about Plato's Republic. Plato, he wrote one book called Republic. It was actually an ideal. It is not something which was realized in practice in the entire Western world. Probably, it is quite, in fact, it is my view that probably Plato was also aware of the Indian philosophy. In those days, of course, they were very much aware because they were also itinerant people. They used to travel a lot. And people from India could go to Greece, people from Greece could come to India. So naturally, Plato could have known something about our Upanishadic philosophy and this Vedanta, Vedic literature. So they were the Rajarshis, the philosopher king. So that concept called philosopher king, probably Plato could have seen here. So he, in that book called Republic, he says, a kingdom has to be ruled by a philosopher king. Only then there will be justice. So a king has to be a person who is so judicious, and he is a philosopher who has risen above all narrow identities and narrow notions of I and mine and my person and another person, likes and dislikes. The man has risen above all these things. So that is what Rajarshi is. So imam Rajarshayo viduhu, says Krishna. So this particular yoga, all this thing was known and put into practice. Not only known, it was put into practice by all these saintly kings, philosopher kings. For example, we get a list of that philosopher kings. For example, we hear the story of Janaka. Janaka is, from Ramayana, we see that Janaka is Sita's father-in-law of Rama. So Janaka, and like that, we have only heard about one famous name. There are many other kings, which are names are not so very popular. But then there are so many Rajarshis in that way. So what Krishna says there is that all these Rajarshis, they practiced this particular yoga, he says. Imam vivasvate yogam. And what is that yoga? And in the Gita, yoga not necessarily means Ashtanga yoga. In fact, the word yoga is in the context of Gita, it is a particular way, a particular strategy to purify oneself, to purify one's antahkarana. Antahkarana is the mind. To purify one's mind means what? I have to purify my mind means that I should get rid of what all this raga, dvesha, etc. Raga, dvesha means all my passions, my prejudices, my likes, my dislikes, and I have to rise above my limited identifying factors, that I belong to a particular religion, I belong to a particular caste, I belong to a particular ideology, let me say. So I have to rise above all these ideologies. I have to rise above religion. I have to rise above my clan. I have to rise above my whatever called patriotism or jingoism, whatever you say. So I have to rise above all these things. And then only we will be able to see the truth. So yoga is something, it is a process of purifying one's mind. A person with that purified mind, he will be fit for anything. He is fit to rule a kingdom, he is fit to fight, he is fit to do anything. So that is what we see. He is fit to do any job. A doctor who reads Gita, a doctor who reads what is called Karma Yoga, who reads what is called Dhyana Yoga or Atma Sanyama Yoga, so he will be a better doctor. A soldier will be a better soldier. A policeman will be a better policeman. A politician, a political leader can be a better political leader. So it basically, Gita is meant to bring about some sort of inner change, a sort of inner transformation in a person, so that a person rises above all the limitations of these identities, and then he does things, whatever he does, in a very, very perfect manner, and in accordance with what is called divine scheme. We see that there is what is called a divine scheme also, because the whole universe is something which is interdependent. Every minute we are dependent on the universe. That is, every minute I am breathing, every few hours or so I will be taking water, I will be taking food, and then every minute I am depending on the universe. Not only me, all the beings are dependent on the universe. And similarly, the universe also has to be taken care of by us. So, if we destroy the universe, if we destroy the ecosystem, if we destroy the ecology, the human being does not survive. So, the whole universe is something which is interdependent. Not only ecology, suppose I hurt the other person, naturally the other person also will hurt me. So, that thing will go on, that chain will go on and on and on. It will not, the world will not have peace. So, if the world has to have some peaceful existence, a person should rise above these things. So, that is how it is. And Gita uses a particular word called the divine will, and working in tune with the divine will. Working in tune with the divine will means this only. That is, we have to understand the entire framework of the universe, how the whole society is interdependent. If you do your dharma, if you do your job in a righteous manner, then only the other person's justice is done to the other person. Suppose I sit in my office and some files come to me, and when I see the files, I have to do it in such a way that I should place myself in the position of God, and I have to see that there is a human being behind that file, and then I am supposed to do justice to him, and that is what is karma yoga. In other words, that is what is karma yoga. It is nothing more. Ishwararpana buddhi. Ishwararpana buddhi means Ishwara means the entire cosmos, the cosmic mind. My mind is in tune with that cosmic mind. So that is what is that Ishwararpana buddhi. So these are certain great things which we find in the Gita. For example, karma yoga. Then again, there are various steps. Gita's objective is to tell a person what is the right thing in the life, in human life. That means doing the right thing and also achieve success. It is not as though a person is, by reading Gita, a person does not become a sannyasi. By reading Gita, a fighter will be a better fighter, as I said. So, by reading Gita, a jnani will be a more perfect jnani. By reading Gita, a yogi will get more enlightened in the process of, in that path of yoga. So, it is mainly to improve our capacity in any field. So, coming to the yoga. Let me talk about yoga. As I said, in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna tells about various ways of self-purification. Why does he say all that? Basically, Arjuna keeps on questioning. Arjuna, in the beginning, Krishna doesn't want to tell all those things. He merely tells about what is the duty of a person. He just tells about what is karma yoga. And then he tells about what is called the ultimate knowledge. What is that supreme reality? And keeping that supreme reality in mind, and then keeping that God's framework in mind, you have to do your job. So that is exactly what he tells. But Arjuna has some questions, then naturally Krishna has to give those answers. In fact, what all Krishna wanted to tell was over by the end of 3rd chapter, Karma Yoga. And after that, he again puts some questions. So that is how naturally it goes on and on and on. And Krishna also very leisurely talks about certain things. So all that, the whole conversation takes place for about roughly 2 hours. If we see the entire Gita, though the Gita appears to be a huge book. In fact, Gita is a very small book, in fact a book of this size only. If you see that original discussion, not in small print, even in ordinary print, it cannot be more than this. About 50 pages in this. So about 700 700 verses. So that is, the discussion goes on for about 2 to 2.5 hours maximum. So that 2 to 2.5 hours, discussion was going on in the battlefield. And of course, you may have a question, why all the people, they were ready to shoot, and then how can this discussion take place and all that. So there are people who do all that questioning also. But we have to we have to remind ourselves that they were the days of what is called Dharma Yuddha. Till the conches were blown, and then till the enemy also shot, they was ready to shoot, they were not shooting, they were not supposed to shoot. It is only when when the opponent also has a bow and arrow in his hand, and when the opponent is shooting, then only you are supposed to shoot. So the Dharma Yuddha, it has got certain rules. So that process, that is how the discussion took place for about 2.5 hours. Don't think that it is something, Gita is something which is inserted by somebody, etc. If you see the whole structure of Bharatam, Srimad Mahabharatam, in the whole structure of Mahabharata, it exactly fits in, and then that is something which is a very, very important thing. very necessary thing also there, because that is something which also explained to the reader, to the later day reader, to the audience also, yes, about the judiciousness of the war, about what Arjuna did in the, not only Arjuna, what Pandavas did in the battlefield. So coming to, okay, anyway, we'll leave at that. And coming to what is called the yoga. This Gita has got a whole chapter on what is called Dhyana Yoga. Now I will try to tally, or rather I will try to compare with the Patanjali Yoga Sutras also, and we will see what the Gita also says. And of course, Patanjali Yoga Sutras, we are not sure whether Patanjali historically, according to say all the scholars, Gita is about 5000 years old, and the Patanjali Yoga Sutras maybe a couple of centuries prior to the present era, the modern era, that is Christian era, BCE, just about 2-3 centuries BCE. We are not very sure about it is not definitely older than Bhagavad, say Mahabharata. But then we see certain parallels. Why? Because in all Indian traditions, as I said, this yoga system is very much there. And what is this yoga? Yoga is simply, it is a question of purifying oneself. That is the only thing. In fact, the word, Sanskrit word yoga, it has got two etymologies. We know that what is etymology, how the word is derived. So according to one etymological meaning, yoga is something to unite. Yujir yoge, from one root, one Sanskrit root called yujir. Yoga means to unite. That is one meaning. That is uniting what with what? Uniting the Jiva with Brahman, uniting the lower self with that infinite self. So that is, I am shaking off all my limited identities and I am becoming one with that universal self. So that is one meaning of yoga. Then another, yujir yoga is one, and yujir is another thing. The other meaning is it is an upaya. It is actually a strategy. It is actually a strategy to achieve something. So that is how in this Bhagavad Gita we see that yoga is used in two senses. Of course, in Patanjali Yoga Sutra, that is yoga union. In that sense only it is used. So in this yoga there are certain basic steps. What are these basic steps? Patanjali in fact has codified. In fact, more than all, in fact, though the system of yoga is there in all the Indian schools, it was Patanjali, we have to give credit to Patanjali for having properly, in a very systematic manner, he has brought out what are called the Yoga Sutras. And in those Yoga Sutras we see various methods, in fact various methods of controlling the mind. Why should we control the mind? Because it is the mind which thinks also. And if we want to think about, first thing we see here in Gita also, Gita and also anywhere in any yoga tradition, the mind has to be pure if it is trying to concentrate on a particular thing. That is needed for all fields. If you are a scientist also, if you are having some preconceived notions, and with all those preconceived notions, if you are trying to think on a subject, your objective will not be proper, your result will not be proper. A scientist has to think with a totally open mind. So similarly, a philosopher has to think with an open mind. Similarly, a seeker, here we are not talking about a philosopher, but we are talking about a seeker. A seeker has to think with an open mind. If the seeker is not having an open mind, and if he is having his own likes, dislikes, prejudices and whatnot, naturally he will not be getting the right result. In fact, I can tell a small story from one Upanishad. There is one Upanishad called Taittiriya Upanishad. In that Taittiriya Upanishad, one great teacher is there, and his son, he wants to know what is that highest reality. So the son goes to his father, "Oh father, teach me, what is that highest reality called Brahman?" Then father, he says, this is something which cannot be straight away told. Yeah, this is what is Brahman, this is what is this, etc. You have to think for yourself. And in order to think, what is it that you have? What is the equipment we have in order to think? The equipment we have is, apart from the body which body cannot think, there are what we call indriya. 5 indriyas are there. Indriyas means sense organs. I am able to see, and when whatever I am able to see, some object is put into my mind. I am able to hear something. I am able to smell something. I am able to taste something. So there are 5 senses. And what all sensory impressions that come to the mind is like a processor, and the mind processes. And the indriyas or the sense organs they are so structured that they are always outward bound. They are always seeing outward. They don't look inward. So that is the tragedy. So the father says, Tapasa Brahma Vijijñāsasva. You realize the truth only by meditation. You realize the truth by thinking. Tapaha is meditation. Tapa alochane. In fact, the etymological meaning for the word tapas is tapa alochane. That is meditating. So you realize the truth by meditation. No other tradition says like this. If you go to a man of religion, he says, no, my religion is the greatest religion, you have to jolly well believe. So religion is basically a belief system. You have to believe in this, otherwise I will kick you. That also is there. But then here in the Upanishads or in any Indian tradition, we see you think and realize. Tapasa Brahma Vijijñāsasva. And for that thinking, the laboratory, your mind is the laboratory. Annam, pranam, chakshushrotram, mano, vachamiti. So you have got the 5 sense organs, you have got the 5 motor organs like hands, feet, etc. and the mind. And with the help of the mind, you try to think, what is your nature? So that is actually our approach. And if we want to think, the mind has to be, as I said, the mind has to be pure, and all the dirt of the mind has to be cleaned. And for cleaning the dirt of the mind, Patanjali gives various steps. And it is called Ashtanga Yoga. Ashta, Anga. Ashta is 8, Anga is limb, and yoga, Ashtanga Yoga, 8 limbed yoga. Though it is called 8 limbs, etc., we can call them 8 steps because one after the other, you have to ascend. You have to ascend the steps. So in this very first step is controlling our external behavior, controlling our outward behavior. That is something which is very much possible. Basically, not hurting anybody, non-injury. The first word used by Patanjali is ahimsa. Ahimsa is non-injury to a person, not necessarily in a physical sense, even mentally. I am not supposed to insult a person. I am not supposed to make any sort of damaging or disparaging statement unnecessarily, cause mental hurt, because the mental hurt causes greater pain than a physical hurt. So this ahimsa, satya, then asteya, not taking away, not grabbing somebody else's property, and aparigraha, not accumulating wealth, etc. Whatever is needed, you have whatever, and don't accumulate more than what you need. So these are certain things. These are part of the external behavior, and that is what he calls it yama. There are various words like yama, niyama, asana, pranayama, pratyahara, dharana, dhyana, samadhi. These are the 8 steps. Yama is controlling our external behavior. And over a period of time when we control the external behavior, naturally it also has an impact on the mind. In fact, one of the great points of yoga is that conscious habits influence the unconscious mind. It is some great principle. It is probably a very great discovery by our Indian thinkers. That is conscious habits. You consciously practice something over a period of time, and then it has an impact on the unconscious mind. So that is how this yama, or controlling the external behavior, becomes the very first step. And then controlling the mind. I may control my external behavior. Suppose I look at something, I want it very badly. And of course, my good sense tells me, no, it is not proper to go and grab it. I may be kicked. So I control my behavior. I behave like a good boy. But then my mind may still be wanting it. So controlling the mind is the very next step. Controlling the mind it can happen only by proper education. Controlling the mind happens by study of maybe good literature, good books, scriptures, etc. So in fact, all our books like Ramayana, Srimad Bhagavatam particularly, Bharatam, these are the books which give so many illustrations about And in fact, by the time if you read these books, so many instances, so many case law, it is almost like case law. So many case laws about people done good, bad, how they have achieved things, etc. So this is what we see. So yama and niyama. Niyama is controlling the mind. When these two things are going on simultaneously also, it is not as though I have to practice yama and only then I have to go to niyama. They can be simultaneously practiced also. But basically one has to have mastery on the first one, so that you will also get mastery in the second one. If you don't have mastery in the first one, we will not have mastery in the other one. So this niyama. Then again, we sit for asana. And in fact, Gita also talks about that. Gita also says, Sushau deshe pratisthapya sthiram asanam atmanah natyuchritam nati nicham chailajana kushottaram. So Krishna says, so what type of asana has to be there? And when we talk about yoga, modern people, usually yoga means only physical exercises that come to our mind. But in about, if you see the Patanjali Yoga Sutras, out of 196 Yoga Sutras, out of 196 or 95 Yoga Sutras, there is only one sutra which talks about asana. Yoga Sutras, it does not, they don't talk about, they don't have so many sutras about asana. And that sutra also is a very, very brief sutra saying sthira sukham asanam, sthira sukham asanam. And the asanam has to be such that it does not disturb you, it does not distract you. You are supposed, you should have you should have a proper posture, so that the posture is something which facilitates your thinking or meditation. So that is asana. Then pranayama, as I said, is another something like conscious practice, unconscious mind, as I said. It is another great discovery by our ancients. That is control of breath is controlling the mind. This is something, it is, in fact, we see so much of modern psychology and whatnot. When did psychology start? If you take any book on psychology, you just take any book on psychology. And when did it start? Sometime in 18th century. So then, what about Patanjali and what about Bhagavad Gita, which talk about all this mind and then the process of the mind and then the thoughts which go on in the mind and how the thoughts have to be controlled and how the thoughts have to be focused on a particular thing. So this is under the discussion. It has so many things, so many books were written for at least 3,000 to 4,000 years. So anyway, so asana and pranayama is regulation of breath. And regulation of breath is something which regulates the mind. If you control the breath, control the mind. So that is something, such a relationship. In fact, we can also know when I am angry, in fact, my breath will become very faster and then I will be panting. When I am very, very cool, breath also will be rather cool. And suppose I consciously practice this pranayama in a very measured manner. And for that pranayama also, there are certain systems. For example, I can do pranayama along with a particular mantra. I can do pranayama without a mantra. And if I am doing pranayama with a mantra, I can also meditate on that pranayama. Then next to pranayama comes another thing called withdrawal of senses from all the sensory objects. That is called pratyahara. Aharam is eating. Prati plus a plus pratyahara is withdrawing. Ahriyate iti ahara. Whatever we eat is ahara. Suppose I look at something, that also is ahara. I smell something, that also is ahara. Ahara not necessarily what we eat. Ahara is what I see, what I smell, what I want. All these are aharas. Something I touch. So all these are aharas. Pratyahara is a gradual withdrawal of mind from all these sense objects. Pratyahara. Now comes the most important point, the next 3 steps. The first 5 steps are mostly physical. Yama, niyama, asana, pranayama and pratyahara. The 5 steps are mostly physical. The next step is totally with the next 3 steps are with the mind. Dharana, dhyana and samadhi. Dharana, when we call dharana, then you are focusing your attention. You are focusing your mind on a particular object. And what should be the object of dharana? Anything can be the object of dharana. Basically, you have to, for practicing dharana, anything can be an object for dharana, and the mind is just focused on that. And focusing mind itself is not the ultimate objective. Suppose I focus my mind on a particular dot in front of me. What is it I am going to achieve? Okay, I am achieving. One great thing is controlling the mind itself is a very great thing. Suppose I am able to focus my mind on a particular dot in front of me, that is a great achievement. But even then, philosophically, what is it that I have achieved? Nothing much. So after that dharana, it has to take me to the next level, because dharana is very essential. Unless I have that ability to concentrate, I will not have the ability to think on particular lines. So the next step is what is called dhyana. That is where we are. Whether it is pyramid dhyana or whether it is some other type of dhyana, because various masters, for example, Patriji has evolved a particular, or he might have also seen from various scriptures, I am not very sure. So this is one type of meditation, and meditations can be various types. So in the meditation, dhyana, what is it we do? Dhyana is, you see, mantra japa. We hear about what is called mantra japa. And what is this japam? Japa is to recall the meaning of that thing and of a mantra, and the entire, all the sequence of thoughts which flow along with that mantra. For example, a particular mantra. A mantra, for example, Gayatri mantra, let us say. Gayatri mantra says, Om Bhuhu, Om Bhuvaha, Om Suvaha, Om Mahaha, Om Janaha, Om Tapaha, Om Satyam, Om Tatsaviturvareniyam, Vargo Devasya Dhimahi, Dhiyo Yona Prachodayat, Om Apo Jyoti Rasomritam Brahma, Bhurbhuvaswaram. This is the total, overall Gayatri mantra. In between Gayatri mantra is only Tatsaviturvareniyam, Vargo Devasya Dhimahi, Dhiyo Yona Prachodayat. But there is some introductory portion, there is a final ending portion also. So with all that, it becomes the whole Gayatri mantra. And what is that? What is it talking about? It talks about that supreme reality called Om. And Om is not something which is something magical or anything. Om is a sort of abbreviation. In fact, that again requires half an hour. If I want to tell about Om, it requires a lot of time. It is a sort of, tentatively, let us accept that it is a sort of abbreviation to denote that universal reality which is there pervading the whole universe. It is there it was there in past, present, and it will be there in the future, past, present, and future, and it will be there at all times. It is something which is never ending. It is something which is of the nature of consciousness, and which is also something which is in the nature of manifesting as the universe. Om Bhuhu, Om Bhuvaha. So what Vedanta or what Upanishads say, even Sankhya Yoga, Sankhya philosophy also, there is one principle called consciousness. And that consciousness is something which is manifesting as the whole reality, as the whole external world. That is one school of thought. And there is another school of thought which says, yes, in addition to the consciousness, there is also what is called the external reality. So this is the problem with which even the modern physics is grappling. So modern physics also is not very sure. In fact, the modern physics, the one important question is matter independent of the mind, or is mind means consciousness, or is consciousness something which is appearing as the matter? So this is something which is a question which is bogging the minds of the scientists even today. So but then philosophers, they have taken some view. In India, this question was not there in the Western philosophy, but this question has been there right from the beginning, from the time of Upanishads in the Indian philosophy. So yoga, the Patanjali Yoga Sutra, they do accept that there is reality to the external world also. In that manner, okay, whatever may be the metaphysical say conclusion, the process of meditation is one and the same, whether it is yoga, Patanjali, whether it is yoga, Vedanta, whether it is Buddhism, or whether it is Jainism, or any school. Process of meditation is that a continuous stream of thoughts, undisturbed by dissimilar thoughts. So that is the definition. A continuous stream of thoughts, tulya pratyaya santatihi. Tulya pratyaya santatihi, that is a stream of similar thoughts. Asankirna cha atat pratyayaihi, not disturbed by dissimilar thoughts. So that is what is the meaning of dhyana. That is, the mind is having so many thoughts coming to us. The moment I look at something, some thought comes to my mind. The next moment I shift my gaze and then look at some other object, some other thing comes to my mind. There are so many thoughts. So all these things have to be removed, and I have to choose whatever is my chosen topic. on that particular topic only, whatever relevant thoughts, that the thoughts which are relevant or with the thoughts which are in consonance with the subject which I am thinking, only those have to flow. We have all heard about the laser beam, all the light rays in the same frequency and the same intensity and in the same direction. They are all in the same direction and same intensity, etc. So, like a laser beam, the thought flow has to be like a laser beam, and they have to go. The similar thoughts have to be in a stream. So, when I am thinking about Gayatri Mantra, for example, Om Bhuhu, the whole universe, what we see as the Bhu, the solid matter, the whole whatever I see as the world, it is nothing but that Om, that supreme consciousness. When I say that supreme consciousness is infinite, even you and I, everybody is part of that infinite only. I am also that not even part. We are that infinity. So that we see the presence of that divinity in everything. Vedanta, the beauty of the Gita, the beauty of even Patanjali Yoga Sutra, the beauty of Sankhya philosophy. The idea is to see divinity in all, to see oneness in everything, to see oneness in everything. So, dhyana involves in focusing the thought, where the stream of similar thoughts, Om Bhuhu, then again Om Bhuvaha, the whole extent, the what all this surrounding, whatever surrounds the earth, the intermediate space as we call it, that again is what is called the same Brahman. What I call some other loka is Brahma, what I call some other loka is Brahma. So, this is, and what is that intelligence which is activating the minds of all the living beings, of all beings, and that intelligence is my real nature, and that intelligence is what is called that supreme reality, what we call Brahman. So, this is what is the thought, it has to, this thought frame or rather thought flow has to go on in my mind when I am doing meditation on Gayatri Mantra. When I am doing meditation on Gayatri Mantra, I have to get the whole picture of how the Brahman is defined in some Upanishads, how Brahman is defined in some other thing. So, the whole thought process, the whole logic, because there is a lot of logical thinking also goes on. So, all the logical thinking has to go on in the mind. So, that is the stream of thoughts. And in fact, Shankaracharya gives the example of Taila Dharavat Tulya Pratyaya Santatihi, he says. Suppose you take some oil in some beaker type of thing. There you have a beaker, and in that beaker you take some thick oil, not very thin oil, very thick oil, and you slowly pour it. When you slowly pour it, then the entire oil falls like a big line, Taila Dhara. It is not broken into globules. If you pour water, it breaks into small globules because that viscosity is not there. So, here that viscosity, because of that viscosity, it forms a long thin line. So, Taila Dhara, he says, Taila Dharavat Tulya Pratyaya Santatihi, he says. So, like that, the thought flow has to be like that. Only then you will be able to think on a particular, on any particular subject. And again we say, after this, what comes? After this, you have got two levels of what is called Samadhi. Samadhi is totally getting absorbed. Samadhi is not English some, SOM, not English SOM is some. Samskrita word Samyak adhiyate manah iti samadhi. That is, the mind is properly put in that. The mind is properly fixed in that. The mind is properly absorbed in that. So, that is a meditative absorption is what is called Samadhi. So, in this Samadhi is again there are two particular levels. One level in which you are contemplating on a particular object, and that particular object is focus, it is in your focus, it is there present in your mind. That is one level of Samadhi. There is another type of Samadhi in which all the thoughts are totally removed, all the thought frames are totally removed. That is another type of Samadhi. So, okay, whatever Samadhi you want to have, you can have that Samadhi. That higher level of Samadhi is more difficult. That is absolutely eliminating all the thoughts and etc. The person, he remains as a conscious entity, nothing else, as pure consciousness he remains. So, that is what yoga says, that is what Vedanta says, in fact, Vedanta says the ultimate objective of a yogi is to become that Brahma. To become that Brahma means, Brahma does not mean a person who is sitting somewhere. Brahma is, that is conscious, pure Nirguna consciousness which has no shape, they are a totally different, that is a different story. So what Buddhism says, you become a Buddha. Jainism says, you become a Jaina Mahavira, Arhan. So like that here it says, yes, you just identify that with that supreme reality. So in this thing, the mind becomes actually the mind again. How is the mind evolved? This is another beautiful thing in our Indian philosophy is, it tells how that the process of evolution it tells. In fact, you don't find it anywhere else. You don't find it in any religion or anywhere. You find it in Indian tradition, that is the process of evolution is told. That is, that one reality which is called consciousness, from that there is what is called Prakriti, we say. And that Prakriti, that is the, what can we say, that is the material cause for the entire universe. Prakriti is the material cause which manifests in that consciousness. And from this material cause, the first evolute or the first thing that comes is what is called the cosmic mind. That in that cosmic mind, the notion of I comes. That is called Ahankara, the cosmic ego, the cosmic mind and the cosmic Ahankara. And from that, of course, what we call the Panchabhutas, that is the whole universe can be reduced into 5 entities called the solid matter, Prithvi, Apaha, that is water, and then again Teja, that is fire, and again what is called air, and then space. Apart from these 5, what all you visualize either on the earth or in any planet or in any other galaxy, some interstellar space, all those places also you find only these 5. Whatever is solid matter, then again some liquid, that is water, what we call water or liquid, then again what we call air, the fire and space. So these, and from these only the 5 elements are derived. From these elements, the 5 elements, how do we know? My I is something which is derived from, it is a transformation from the light which we the fire or light which is there outside. Because my eye can see only the light. Then again my body, the skin, the sense of touch, it can only have the sense of what is called heat. And similarly, but sense of taste, it can only taste, and it can't see things, my tongue cannot see things, my tongue cannot hear. Whereas my mind is a collective product of all the 5. So in Vedanta, there is a big discussion about how this mind and the senses are evolved. Not only Vedanta, even in Patanjali's Yoga Sutra also, how the mind and the senses are evolved. So this is a wonderful thing. And when we say that yogis also attain some powers. Yogis, we hear about some yogis attaining some spiritual powers, etc. How is that? It is not something which is magical. Of course, I don't. If you want me to demonstrate, I may not be. I am not able to. I can't demonstrate. But we find that yogis who have perfected their minds, who have trained who have attained perfection in samadhi, who have attained perfection in that dhyana, meditation, etc. They are able to concentrate. They are able to concentrate to such an extent that they are able to shake off their limited identity. By that limited identity, I said, my limited identity is, I am so and so, my name is so and so Aravind Rao, I belong to a particular place, I belong to a particular caste, I belong to a particular religion, I belong to this, I belong to that, etc., etc. And I am a father, I am a son, I am this, that, etc. All this is my identity. So a seeker goes beyond all these things, and in that process of meditation, he identifies with the cosmic mind. The individual mind, when it becomes absolutely pure and rid of all what is called raga, dvesha, all what is called I, mine, and then my likes and dislikes and whatnot, then it becomes, what is it? It is equal to the cosmic mind. Because, for example, there is a sunlight. The sunlight which is falling on a surface, for example, there is a water surface. And the water is shaky, for example. Suppose the water is shaky and there is some sort of turbulence in the water, or the water, there is also some turbidity in the water. So the light which is coming, the sunlight which is falling on that, the image will not be perfect. The light will not be reflected properly. Unless there is no turbidity in that water, and that the turbulence, that movement also has to should not be there. It has to be a totally still place, totally still. It should be like a plain glass. So when the mind is so clean, absolutely no raga, dvesha, etc., then the light reflection also is very, very pure. So the mind is something which becomes one with the infinite mind, one with the cosmic mind, and that is how the yogi or the person who is meditating, he is also capable of getting some supernatural powers. Of course, this is not, I am not telling this, I am not telling this. Patanjali Yoga Sutras tell this. I am myself, I have seen some people, who display certain same skills, but then I have not achieved them. So I am not competent to talk on them. But Patanjali tells, and we also see so many examples of people who lived and then who and their contemporaries, they have recorded all those powers, etc. So this Patanjali Yoga Sutra, in fact, the third Patanjali Yoga Sutras, it is in actually 4 parts. The first part is called what is called Samadhi Pada. How a person, what type of Samadhi, what is called Samadhi, and how a person has to attain that Samadhi, what is the process, etc. Then Sadhana. Sadhana is the second chapter, where the process of purifying the mind, it has to go on. Yama, Niyama, Asana, Pranayama, etc., they all go on. And in the third part, it is called the Vibhuti, Vibhuti Pada. Vibhuti means all this supernatural. For us, it appears supernatural. But then for the yogi, it is something which is natural. Because his mind is no longer the individuated mind, is no longer the individual mind confined to some body-mind complex. It is something which has unified, it has merged with the cosmic mind. When this individual mind has merged with the cosmic mind, then naturally what happens? Then naturally whatever the cosmic mind can do and whatever powers the cosmic mind has, this individual mind also automatically gets it. So that is what Patanjali says, and that is how he talks about what is called Sarva Bhuta Jnanam, and he talks about various, suppose a yogi, he will know what various animals are speaking. Some people, in fact, we hear about all these stories like some Kathas Harit Sagaram, books like that if you see. So the king's son and the minister's son, they are walking, and the minister's son listens to the birds chirping, and then he says, oh, the birds are talking like that. So like that, we hear about so many things. And we also see that in history also, we hear accounts of people who had this. And Sarva Bhuta Rutagyanam. Similarly, now in psychology, modern psychology has taken lot many ideas from the yoga principles. For example, what we call the past life regression. Now, lot many experiments are going on regarding the past life regression. That is actually one sutra from Patanjali Yoga. Samskara Sakshatkarat. That is, if you concentrate on the latent, impressions which are there in the mind, then over a period of time, if you go back and back and back, recalling all those samskaras, then you will reach a stage where you will know what was your earlier birth. And if you are if you can concentrate, if you can focus more, you will get more. So it is, ability of mind is something which is phenomenal according to yoga philosophy. So that is what we see, and we are really fortunate that we belong to this type of this tradition. And in fact, unfortunately, in India, somehow this yoga tradition is confined to some physical exercises, and that too, thanks to people like Baba Ramdev, this yoga, at least physical exercises, some people are doing. But the actual yogic practices and attaining some siddhis, it is some people like Patriji, etc., they are doing something, they are trying to do something. And in fact, the Tibetan Buddhists, they have done a lot of practice in this particular field. So this yoga is a wonderful tradition which is there in the Bhagavad Gita, that is in the Vedanta tradition, which is there in all the Indian traditions, and it is something which is universal in nature, because the human mind is same whether you are born in India or in Australia or some Timbuktu or some other place or Alaska, anywhere, the human mind is same. The same sattva, rajas, tamo gunas, the constitution of the mind is same. The human nature is same. When the human nature and constitution is same, then naturally the yoga principles, they do apply. So that is how this yoga has become very, very powerful. And it is a very interesting subject which we are all supposed to know. So I will end with this talk, and my respects to Patriji for continuing such a great job, and I also give my best wishes to the viewers. Thank you.